I love this story. It's not the lesson that you'd think would be the introduction to a great understanding of faith. But it goes like this. In Mark chapter 8, verse 14, it says, "Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat." You would never think the fact that 13 guys on a road trip only remembering to bring one loaf of bread could be an introduction to a really deep understanding of faith. But it is. This little moment in their lives is a key thing that Jesus uses to illustrate that these men that have been traveling with him and learning from him are still oftentimes not learning the lessons of faith that they're supposed to be learning. And it's vital for them. It's vital for the whole church. Thankfully, they do learn these things, but Jesus has something to teach about why our hearts don't always grasp what's going on. I mean, some people think about faith like, have you ever heard the statement, "I'll believe it when I see it"? Where people think that once there's enough proof, then I'll believe something. But proof and belief are kind of the exact opposites. Proof is so much information, so much evidence that you don't need to believe anything. Like the story that goes just before this, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they come to Jesus and they demand a sign. They're saying, "Prove it to us. We don't want to have to believe." And Jesus says, no, it's really a wickedness of your heart that demands proof. So I'm not going to give you any. You see, it's always there, the need to learn the lesson of faith. And these guys are in a boat with one loaf of bread, and Jesus says, "I have something to teach you." You have to remember, there's a context to this story, just like there is every story in the Bible. The context of this story about bread is that the disciples have had two massive bread illustrations for them already. They have been part of two amazing miracles. Miracles that today, if you saw them, you would have your jaw hanging. And those disciples were immersed in those miracles, but they didn't get the point. They didn't get the full message. They didn't understand what it meant. So here's the context. 2 times in Jesus' life, he fed massive crowds with small amounts of bread. So he went first, he was in near Galilee, and there's Jewish people there listening to him, a crowd of 5,000 men. It specifically says men, because they, in those days, just counting the men, the head of the household that was there listening, but it was probably about 15,000 people that were there in some way, either listening to Jesus or being part of the family group that was listening to Jesus. And Jesus is going to feed all 5,000 of them with bread. So he gets this small amount, 5 loaves, to feed 5,000 men, 15,000 people, and he begins to break it up and distribute it among his disciples. As he's distributing it, it's multiplying. It's becoming more and more and more and more and more and more. If you were to measure how much bread it takes to feed 15,000 people, well, I did a bit of research. It would take about 1.5 semi-trailer truckloads of bread to feed 15,000 people. And then Jesus does it again. He feeds 4,000 people, this time with 7 loaves. And the bread is multiplying around. Now we're feeding something like in the order of 15,000 people and probably maybe 12,000 people. We now have 27,000 people that have been fed with 12 loaves of bread. If you were there, surely this would have made an impression on you. The disciples, in the first case, walked away with 12 basketfuls of bread left over. They started with 5 loaves. If you do the numbers very quickly, it's 5 loaves, 5,000 people. 1 loaf feeds 1,000 people. That's a huge amount. The second time, 7 loaves, we got 4,000 people. That makes, let's do quick, 871 people can be fed by 1 loaf of bread. That's supposed to mean something, right? It's supposed to touch your heart. It's supposed to make you change. It's supposed to let you know that Jesus Christ has the power to do things that no one else can. It's supposed to comfort you. It's supposed to reassure you. It's supposed to give you giant faith. But the disciples, they walk away from this experience of being buried in bread, and they haven't seen it. They haven't understood it. They haven't grasped it. Because the moment they get into the boat and they've only got 1 loaf of bread, Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they go, oh great, we're in trouble again. This time it's because we didn't bring enough bread. And Jesus says, bread? Bread? Do you think I need you to bring bread? Sometimes I think we learn the wrong lesson. The things that we can get in trouble for, the things that we feel guilty about, the things that we think we're letting God down in, are oftentimes the things that we're doing. But the thing that the disciples got in trouble most from was not what they did. It was from their lack of belief. Could it be that the biggest problem that we face is a lack of faith, not a lack of doing? And maybe the doing comes out of our faith. So this is how it actually goes. This is what happened on the day on that boat. It says, now they'd forgotten to bring bread. We already read that. And they only had one loaf with them. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, Herod is part of the party of the Sadducees, and other translations, Sadducees. So they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, says to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 12. They're total teenagers in trouble. 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? I think this is a really important thing. These are disciples. Listen, a lot of people think, man, if I was in the time of Jesus, if I saw him raise the dead, if I saw those miracles, my faith would be so strong, it'd be awesome. But the fact is, we have the proof that these 12 guys with Jesus were there the whole time. They saw everything from the changing of the water into wine to the resurrection of Lazarus. They saw everything. And they struggled to believe. They struggled because of something that Jesus is saying is internal to them. Hardened hearts. They've got eyes, but they don't see. The things are happening around them, but they're not picking up on them. And this is, my friends, was what I'm really concerned about for all of us. What is God doing? What is God saying? What is the reality of what's happening with God, with Jesus, that we're just not picking up on? I mean, right now, in the moment we're in the world, there's a lot of people who are in a kind of panic. They're kind of either trying to pretend that it's not happening, or they're over-predicting the worst outcomes from things. The question really isn't what's happening now. It's, who is God? What is he like? What can he do for us? Because there's been so many illustrations in our lives of the love, the grace, the help of God, the power and reality of him that we just haven't picked up. And the reason we haven't picked it up is because there's this kind of heart infection. Jesus called it yeast, because yeast is what makes this kind of bread blow up into this shape. Without yeast, this is flat. This is, but without yeast, it has the same amount of substance, the same amount of food energy. It's just yeast kind of blows things up into an unreality. And Jesus says, you've got some yeast in you, fellas, and watch out for it. I just want to take a moment to explain to you what he meant by the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, a little bit of background. I love history, you may not, so just indulge me for a second. Jesus brings up two groups that you may not have heard of, or maybe you only know a little bit about. The first group is called the Pharisees. Now, this word is just really an old Aramaic word for sort of separate. So these guys were people who believed in sort of separating themselves from society, meaning that like the general population was evil, bad, unholy, not following the rules, not following the commandments. So these people kind of separated themselves out from society, out from the rest of humanity, and sort of set a higher standard. We're gonna be holy, be good, and if we be good, this is what they believe, if we be good, then God will help us. Now, the other group of people, they're the SADDUCEES. Now, you might be able to see in there, although it's a little bit changed, it's the word Zadok. Zadok. If you're a fan of the Old Testament in the Bible, you'll know that Zadok was the priesthood that was established sort of under David's time and sort of reckoned as the, sort of the legitimate priesthood that kind of worked with the kingship. Now, these guys, they both developed as influential groups in the community during the time that the Israelites were away in Babylon. If you remember, there was 70 years of their history was spent under the control of the Babylonian Empire until they were ultimately released to go and rebuild their temple and their city. They went back to Jerusalem, but some of these ideas stayed with him. Now, you kind of think, well, what's Zadok got to do with this? Well, here's the sort of the basic things. The high priesthood isn't just something about sort of taking care of the temple and doing all the rituals and stuff that God commanded. The high priesthood became a political institution, a place of power, a place of control, a place where basically if we don't agree with you, we're not going to let you do things, and we're going to get the crowd to turn against you. So governments had to work with the high priesthood, and by the time of Jesus, the high priesthood was really a place of political power. The Pharisees were a separating group. They were a group that sort of controlled things from a more religious standpoint. Just got to get the spelling right. They were people who tried to sort of raise the holiness of the people of Israel. So if I could just sort of represent these two people in this way, just draw a little guy. These guys, they tried to wear a halo. They tried to be more holy. These guys, they tried to wear, you're probably thinking, what's he going to say now? Well, these guys, they tried to wear a crown. These guys thought, if I can get enough power, then I can get what I need in life. These guys think, if I can just be good enough, then God will help me. Now, Jesus says, both these are kind of like a yeast activity that happens in your heart. Now, what does that really mean? Well, here's the way it kind of breaks down. If I can be holy, then God will help me. But these guys don't believe that God will help you, so you need your own power. So we have over here power. If I've got enough power in life, then I don't need to trust in God. I don't need to depend on God. In fact, these guys didn't believe that God really helped anyone. In fact, there's a lot of people in the world that think that God just made everything and just sort of gave up. You can't rely on Him. You can't turn to Him. There's no way. What do you mean believe? What do you mean faith? You just sort of do best that you can with the abilities. Now, what happened with these guys then, and this is what you'll notice, is the people who rely on themselves oftentimes cut corners. They kind of, cheat in life a little bit. They're not going to keep the rules, keep the law. They're not going to be holy because they're happy to sort of make do with where they can, And I think here's the problem. When you stop trusting God, you start trusting you. And when you're trusting you and your own abilities and your own power, that's a great source for sin. Because you start taking advantage of people, start taking advantage of your own opportunities and your own power. And it leads us into a place of sinfulness. These groups didn't worry about holiness. They only worried about power. But this group didn't worry about power. They just worried about holiness. Now, here's the other problem with that, is that if you're relying on your own holiness, when are you ever good enough? And then where does faith come into it? Because holiness is something you're working at. You're working for it. And if I'm good, then God has to pay me for being good. If I keep the commandments, then he has to bless me. So faith then is not in God. Faith is in yourself. You see how both these groups, my holiness and my power, we're not relying on God anymore. Well, Jesus is saying that this sort of thing, it affects all of us. Let me read you this story from the book of Genesis. This is the way that Satan tried to get the people of this world to believe what God was like. He was twisting God's image. It says here in verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden." But God did say, "Of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, you shouldn't touch it, lest you die." And then the serpent, Satan, says to Eve, "You'll not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate it and also gave it to her husband that was with her, and he ate it. You see, the sin comes when we lose a true picture of what God is like. Satan wants to say, God is not going to give you something good. He's not going to help you. He's not out for your best interest. He's out for his own best interest. Now, that is an absolute lie. God is entirely devoted to our interests, and that means we need to follow his ways, because that is what brings us goodness and life. He's not trying to hold out on anything from us. But you see, if I have to work hard to get God to give me something good, then that means that God is not good himself. He's not generous or kind. He's holding back until, well, little people, you can work really hard and then eventually you might please me and then I'll give you a bunch of stuff, but just a little, just to keep you depending on me. Now that's the God of religion, the God of works, God where you're depending on yourself. Now, the Sadducees, well, see, they do believe that God isn't interested. He's not helping. Now, I just want to show you that this is not the God of the Bible, and this is not the God of Jesus Christ. 2 times Jesus is approached. I'm just going to show you 2 different things that happen. First time, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, verse 12, when he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy, and when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I will," or "I am willing, be clean." So when it comes to what God is like, this is what your faith needs to grasp. God is willing. God is willing. God's will is to help us. But let me show you another story. This one comes from Mark chapter 9. In this case, there's a boy possessed by a demon. The man has come to the disciples, but the disciples don't have enough faith to deliver the boy of the demon. Jesus has been on the Mount Transfiguration. He comes back in, says, what's going on? Crowd gathers. And so Jesus is solving this problem quicker maybe than he would have, but he decides, rather than do something in front of a crowd, that Jesus talks to the man and he says to him, how long has this been happening to him? This is from verse 22. 21, the man says, from childhood. Verse 22, and it's often cast him into fire and water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And then Jesus delivers the boy of the demon. Now, this is what you need to take away from that. The man says, if you can. The leprosy man said, if you're willing. This man says, if you can. And this is what we need to know. God is able. He can do what we need. He has the power. These guys thought God couldn't. These guys thought God wasn't willing to. But Jesus proves everyone wrong because God is both willing and He can. And that, my friends, is where our faith needs to be. Right now, in this moment, in your life, you need to know that God is willing to help you. He is kind, He is gentle, He is gracious. He doesn't ask you to earn it. He doesn't expect you to live up to it. He wants to help you. Why? Because He is so caring and so loving. And the second thing you know is that God is powerful. He can change things. He can heal things. He can transform our worlds if we just believe. Jesus said, all things are possible for those who believe. So my friends, get rid of that yeast, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and put your faith totally in the God who loves you and helps you. He can multiply your bread. If you notice back in your life, you have been surrounded by the many times that God has done things. If He's done it before, He can do it again. And that is the lesson of faith. Have an open heart, open eyes, and see that God is able and He is willing. Why? Because He loves you.